By the early 20th century, industrial capacity had become a decisive factor in large-scale warfare. Modern armies required not only trained personnel, but also steady access to weapons, vehicles, fuel, food, and raw materials. The Second World War intensified this dependency. By 1941, the conflict had expanded across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, placing unprecedented strain on national economies. At that time, the United States was formally neutral. However, the government in Washington recognized that the outcome of the war would affect American security and economic interests. Britain, fighting Germany since September 1939, faced severe financial and material shortages. The Soviet Union, invaded by Germany in June 1941, confronted enormous losses of equipment and territory. China had been at war with Japan since 1937 and remained dependent on limited external supply routes. In this context, the United States developed a system to provide material assistance to countries fighting the Axis powers without requiring immediate payment. This system became known as Lend-Lease. It was formalized through legislation passed by the U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 11, 1941. This documentary examines the Lend-Lease Program as a logistical and economic operation rather than a political slogan. It focuses on documented legislation, production figures, delivery routes, and outcomes. It also distinguishes between established facts and later historical interpretation. The emphasis is on how material support affected the capacity of Allied nations to continue fighting during critical phases of the war. The origins of Lend-Lease lie in the financial limitations imposed on Britain during the first 18 months of the war. By late 1940, British gold reserves and foreign currency holdings were nearly exhausted. Under existing U.S. neutrality laws, Britain was required to pay cash for war materials and transport them using its own ships. President Roosevelt sought a legal mechanism to bypass these restrictions while avoiding a formal declaration of war. In December 1940, he proposed a system under which the United States would supply war materials to countries whose defense he deemed vital to American security. Documented fact: the Lend-Lease Act was formally titled An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States. It passed the U.S. House of Representatives on February 8, 1941, and the Senate on March 8, 1941. The law authorized the President to sell, transfer, exchange, lease, or lend defense articles to any country whose defense was considered essential to U.S. security. Payment could be deferred, waived, or replaced by reciprocal aid. Initial implementation focused on the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth. U.S. War Department records show that early deliveries included aircraft, artillery, ammunition, trucks, and naval vessels. Historian interpretation. Historians generally agree that Lend-Lease marked a shift from neutrality toward active material involvement in the war, though it did not yet constitute direct military participation. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the scope of Lend-Lease expanded. Despite ideological differences, the U.S. government determined that supporting the Soviet war effort served strategic interests. By late 1941, Lend-Lease agreements were also extended to China and other Allied nations. The effectiveness of Lend-Lease depended on American industrial output. Prior to 1940, the United States had not fully mobilized for war production. However, government contracts and planning rapidly expanded manufacturing capacity. Documented fact: between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 297,000 military aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, and hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces and vehicles, according to War Production Board data. Factories that had previously produced civilian goods were converted to military production. Automobile plants manufactured trucks and tanks, while aircraft factories expanded or were newly constructed. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, coordinated resource allocation, labor, and industrial priorities. Lend-Lease orders were integrated into overall production planning rather than treated as surplus output. Production was not limited to weapons. Large quantities of food, clothing, medical supplies, and industrial machinery were shipped overseas. By 1943, American factories were producing more war material than all Axis powers combined in several categories. This surplus capacity made sustained supply to multiple allies possible. Britain was the primary recipient of Lend-Lease aid. From 1941 to 1945, the United Kingdom received approximately $31.4 billion in goods and services under the program. Documented fact: U.S. Treasury records list deliveries to Britain that included 7,411 aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, and substantial quantities of ammunition and fuel. These supplies played a critical role during periods when Britain faced intense pressure, particularly during the Battle of the Atlantic. Merchant shipping losses threatened the island's ability to import food and fuel. Lend-Lease also included naval support. The United States transferred destroyers, escort vessels, and equipment essential for anti-submarine warfare. Historian interpretation. Many historians argue that Lend-Lease allowed Britain to allocate its limited industrial capacity toward aircraft engines, radar, and specialized weapons rather than mass production of basic equipment. British government records indicate that American trucks and vehicles became standard in British and Commonwealth units operating in North Africa and later in Europe. Food shipments were particularly significant. U.S. agricultural exports helped stabilize British civilian rations and maintain morale, as documented in Ministry of Food reports. By 1944, British forces participating in the Normandy invasion relied heavily on American-produced vehicles, fuel, and logistical support. The Soviet Union received approximately $11.3 billion in Lend-Lease aid between 1941 and 1945. Deliveries began in limited quantities in late 1941 and increased substantially from 1942 onward. Documented fact: according to U.S. War Department and Soviet acceptance records, shipments included 14,795 aircraft, 7,056 tanks, and 427,284 trucks. Aid reached the Soviet Union through several routes. Arctic convoys transported supplies to ports such as Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Persian Corridor moved goods through Iran. Pacific shipments arrived at Vladivostok under neutrality arrangements with Japan. Truck deliveries were particularly significant. Soviet records show that American trucks improved mobility for artillery, logistics, and command units. Historian interpretation. Many historians emphasize that Lend-Lease did not replace Soviet production but supplemented it at critical points, especially during 1941–1942, when Soviet industry was relocating eastward. Food shipments also played a role. U.S. canned meat and grains supplemented Soviet rations for frontline troops. Soviet leadership publicly downplayed the importance of Lend-Lease during the war. However, post-war acknowledgments by Soviet officials recognized its contribution to transportation and logistics. China received approximately $1.6 billion in Lend-Lease aid. Deliveries were constrained by geography and Japanese control of coastal regions. Documented fact: supplies reached China primarily via the Burma Road until its closure in 1942, and later by air over the Himalayas, known as the Hump. Aid included aircraft, small arms, ammunition, and medical supplies. American training missions also accompanied material deliveries. Lend-Lease was extended to Free French forces, the Netherlands, Norway, and other governments in exile. These deliveries supported reconstituted military units operating alongside Allied forces. Historian interpretation: while smaller in scale, these contributions enabled Allied cohesion and standardized equipment across multinational forces. Transporting Lend-Lease supplies posed significant logistical challenges. German submarines targeted Atlantic convoys, while Arctic routes exposed ships to extreme weather and air attack. Documented fact: U.S. Navy and British Admiralty records document heavy losses in early Arctic convoys, particularly in 1942. Improvements in escort tactics, shipbuilding, and anti-submarine warfare reduced losses over time. The Persian Corridor required extensive infrastructure development, including ports, railways, and roads. U.S. Army engineers oversaw much of this work. Historian interpretation: logistics historians argue that the ability to sustain multiple supply routes reduced vulnerability and ensured continuity of deliveries. By 1945, the Lend-Lease program had transferred approximately $50.10 billion in goods and services to Allied nations. Documented fact: U.S. government studies concluded that Lend-Lease materially increased Allied combat power and endurance. The program allowed Britain to remain in the war after 1940, supported Soviet counteroffensives during critical periods, and sustained Chinese resistance against Japan. Historian interpretation: while Allied victory depended on many factors, most historians agree that Lend-Lease shortened the war by accelerating material superiority. Lend-Lease also shaped post-war relations, influencing economic recovery and political alignment. The Lend-Lease program represented a systematic application of industrial capacity to global warfare. Rather than a single operation, it functioned as an ongoing process of production, transportation, and allocation. Archival records demonstrate that Lend-Lease supplied not only weapons, but the logistical foundation required to use them effectively. Trucks, fuel, food, and spare parts were as significant as aircraft and tanks. The program's impact lay in scale and continuity. By sustaining multiple allies over several years, it contributed to the material imbalance that eventually overwhelmed the Axis powers. In historical evaluation, Lend-Lease stands as a documented example of how economic and industrial policy can shape military outcomes.